Namaste. My name is Amish Tripathi and I'm the director of the Nehru Center. Those of you who watch our online programs regularly would recognize what this seminar is about. But those who are joining in for the first time, let me give you an introduction. What we are doing through these seminar series is commemorating the various battles of the 1971 war of liberation of Bangladesh, where Bangladesh was liberated from the clutches of West Pakistan, and India fought a war for that, and of course supported the Bukti Bahini of the former East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh. In the seminars that led up to this, in the first seminar, we covered the naval blockade of Karachi port in what was West Pakistan at that time. In the second webinar, we covered the operations by the Indian aircraft carrier. And the third webinar covered special operations that were conducted at that times East Pakistan. And now this fourth one will cover undersea operations. And my hum saya in all these webinars is, of course, the ever redoubtable Commodore Shrikant Kesnur. If he can be brought up on stage, please. Hi, Shrikant, how are you?
Hi, good evening or good afternoon as per your time. Good evening. Yeah. Always good to connect with you. Wonderful to see you again.
Shrikant, if I can just do your formal introduction before we bring up the rest of our guests and start the program. Shrikant is an alumnus of the prestigious National Defence Academy. In his 35-year career, he has had extensive experience in maritime operations, training, leadership, diplomacy, and communication. Yes, he's had a 35-year career. He clearly lives in a fridge, extremely well maintained. He has been the captain of 2 frontline ships, and in addition, his tours of duty have witnessed several important assignments, prestigious courses, and interesting tenures at sea, ashore, and abroad. He was also the defense advisor at the High Commission of India in Nairobi, Kenya, with Kenya, Tanzania, Seychelles, Eritrea, and Somalia as his area of responsibility. He has a PhD from Mumbai University, apart from 5 postgraduate degrees in science and social sciences. He is presently the director of the Maritime Warfare Center, Mumbai, and also the officer in charge of the Naval History Project. He has been conferred the Vishisht Seva Medal in the Republic Day Awards this year. Shrikant.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Amish. As you brought out, we discussed very interesting things in the first 3 episodes. And the fourth one, we are focusing on the undersea warfare, the deep, dark, stealthy, secretive world of what happens. I mean, as it is, the sea is mysterious. So you can imagine that undersea warfare is even more mysterious and something that is stuff of fable, legend, adventure. Now, the 1971 war saw quite a bit of undersea warfare action. There was the classic luring, deception, and sinking of the Pakistani naval submarine Ghazi. Then there was the poignant loss of INS Khukri, showing courage under fire, led by Captain Mahendranath Mulla. And then there was the not very much spoken about, but our own submarines were deployed in the war. And, you know, we need to know about that too. So these 3 things, what all they add up to, what are the lessons, whether in leadership or camaraderie or technology, I think we're looking forward to all that. And we got 2 very good panelists today. We got Commodore S.N. Singh, who was a participant in the war, and we got Commodore Anil Jaisingh, who's a renowned author, writer, and a submariner. So if we can have them both, and then we could introduce them and take the conversation forward.
Namaste, sirs.
Good afternoon, Amish. Nice to see you. Hi, Shrikant.
Hello, sir. Good evening, good afternoon. If you're in India, good evening. If you're in Europe, good afternoon. But wonderful to sort of connect with both of you, sir. Sir, as you might have been hearing in the background, we are discussing undersea warfare aspects here. And it is my pleasure, it's in fact our pleasure to host both of you, and my pleasure to introduce Commodore S.N. Singh. Amish, our viewers will be astonished to know that Commodore S.N. Singh is a participant in the war, and he actually survived the attack on Khukri. He was picked up from sea, and we will, of course, talk about that. But to briefly introduce him, Commodore S.N. Singh, as we said, was commissioned shortly after. He was a midshipman at that time, commissioned shortly thereafter. He's a specialist in gunnery, and thereafter he tended to lots of gunnery assignments, prestigious gunnery assignments in the Navy. I think the foremost of them was being the gunnery officer of Kesri, the commissioning gunnery officer. And then he spent 7 years on the prestigious SNFs, the Rajput class, in different assignments. Then in the mid-80s, he had his first command. He commanded the INS Shardul. And that is when, incidentally, I, as a midshipman, sailed on the Shardul for a couple of months, and I was able to see the very flamboyant Lieutenant Commander S.N. Singh at that time. And then as a commander, he commanded the INS Veer. He was also the divisional commander of the missile vessels. He was the captain worker. He commanded the Taragiri in the rank of a captain. He's attended the National Defense College course, the Staff College course. He's also had extensive stint in training. He taught at the Staff College, and then he was the CSO training, in charge of training at our Southern Naval Command in Kochi. He also was the head of the College of Naval Warfare in Bombay, that means which was in charge for higher defense studies. And then he was also the Commodore Bureau of Sailors, that means the entire HR of our sailors was looked after by him, so for a couple of years. So he's had a very wide and varied career. After his retirement, he did a stint with the NMF for a while. And then now, as he says, he's looking forward to getting back into the social circuit after the COVID pandemic goes away. So very active, very social, and delight to listen to a great raconteur. Welcome, sir, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, sir. It's my honor now, Shrikant, to introduce Commodore Anil Jai Singh. Commissioned in January 1981, Commodore Anil Jai Singh served in the Indian Navy for over 3 decades and took early retirement in March 2011. After joining the Navy, he volunteered to become a submariner. He specialized in anti-submarine warfare from the erstwhile USSR and was the commissioning ASW officer of the 2 Kilo class submarines at Riga. He had the privilege of 5 command tenures at sea, including the command of 4 submarines and a fleet ship. His shore appointments include stints in naval headquarters and the directorates of naval plans and submarine acquisition. He's also served as a naval advisor at the Indian High Commission in the UK, right here, from mid-26 to mid-2009. And he was the Deputy Assistant Chief Maritime for Perspective Planning in the MOD's Integrated Defense Staff. An alumnus of the NDA, the Staff College and Naval War College, he is fortunate to have also been instructor at the Submarine Warfare School, the Senior Instructor Navy at the NDA, and directing staff at the Naval War College. In his second innings, he's a Senior Vice President at a leading European multinational in India, the Vice President of the Indian Maritime Foundation, and the Vice President of the Navy Foundation's Delhi chapter, and has co-chaired the National Defense and Aerospace Committee of ASSOCHAM, a leading industry association, and has been a member of the Defense Audit Advisory Board. He takes a keen interest in matters maritime and writes and speaks on the subject at various fora in India and abroad, the latest fora being the Nehru Center right here. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us.
Thank you for those very kind words, Amish. Thank you.
Shrikant, if you can start, because first we have to have Anil.
Yeah, we have to have Anil. So while we not the Anil that we have on our screen now.
Oh, sorry, sir. No, I would never refer to you as Anil. I would always say, Sir Commodore Anil.
So-
There's another Anil.
As with most episodes, we have our most able sort of Sutradhar and the episode navigator, as we call him, Commodore Anil Jaggi, the Naval Advisor at the High Commission of India in London, who sets the stage beautifully. So I think we'll call him to explain what happened so that the conversation can flow smoothly thereafter. Anil, over to you.
Thank you, Commodore Kesnur. For the benefit of our listeners, let me provide some details and peculiarities of undersea warfare, submarine operations, and the webinar topics of the day. In the underwater domain, the most potent and stealthy platform of choice is a submarine. A submarine is difficult to detect, and stealth is her most important characteristic. Active sonars, which transmit sound waves, are the most effective way for detecting a submarine. The temperature and pressure gradients and the way sound waves bend in the oceans determine the detection probability of the submarine in the region. Submariners are very adept at positioning their submarines between the bending sound waves in areas called shadow zones, thereby avoiding detection. Perceived presence of a submarine is an omnipresent threat for an adversary naval force. To counter the submarine threat, adequate protection for high-value naval assets is provided, and anti-submarine measures, including maneuvers, are employed by the naval forces while operating in the submarine probable area. Nuclear submarines have greater endurance, higher speeds, freedom of movement, as well as flexibility in redeployment in comparison with the conventional or diesel-electric submarines. On the other hand, diesel-electric submarines are incredibly quiet, especially when moving at low speeds and when dived. They are, however, extremely vulnerable when they have to surface regularly to recharge their batteries and to supply fresh air for the diesel engines. Once a submarine's presence is known, or when it is positively detected, it is difficult for the submarine to escape, and as we say in the Navy, she is a sitting duck. It is noteworthy that during the 1971 conflict, only conventional or non-nuclear submarines were available with both India and Pakistan. It was therefore critical for both India and Pakistan to pre-position the submarines in appropriate patrol areas much before the declaration of hostilities during the 1971 war. We'll hear more about this during the discussions. With this as the background, let me now briefly cover the three noteworthy underwater warfare events of the 1971 War of Liberation of Bangladesh. The first is the sinking of Pakistan Navy submarine Ghazi, which was a momentous event of the 1971 conflict for the Indian Navy. PNS Ghazi was dispatched to the Bay of Bengal on 14th November 1971 from Karachi, well before the commencement of hostilities. The decision of the Ghazi deployment was a strategically significant one, as locating and targeting INS Vikrant, India's only aircraft carrier, would have been the primary objective of the Pakistan Navy. Ghazi was chosen as she was the only submarine of the Pakistan Navy which had the necessary endurance to be deployed at such a distance from Karachi. Indian Navy on its part had already appreciated the deployment of Ghazi in the Bay of Bengal. Accordingly, certain important operational decisions were implemented and deceptive measures employed prior to and post commencement of the hostilities, which lured PNS Ghazi to its subsequent doom. The noteworthy amongst these were the strategic repositioning of the Indian Navy's aircraft carrier Vikrant from west to east, well before the hostilities, misleading the Pakistani Navy in believing that Vikrant would be transiting from Chennai to Visakhapatnam, putting in place elaborate anti-submarine warfare measures, including utilization of INS Rajput as a decoy for INS Vikrant, and deception through counterintelligence and simulated signal traffic. While the exact reason for the sinking of PNS Ghazi has not been positively established, however, it is largely believed that on the night of 3rd and 4th December 1971, as INS Rajput was leaving Visakhapatnam harbor, Ghazi surfaced right in front of Rajput to establish her navigational position. Probably seeing or hearing the destroyer approaching her at high speeds, almost on a reciprocal course, Ghazi had to undertake an emergency dive. It is possible that the desperate dive and explosions from the depth charges dropped by Rajput may have resulted in damage and hard bottoming of Ghazi in shallow waters. This is likely to have led to internal fires and explosions of its munitions, thereby causing the destruction of Ghazi. Let me now throw some light on the unfortunate loss of Indian Navy ship Khukri during the 1971 war. In this context, certain facts are notable. Firstly, based on the comparative assessment of naval forces, the Indian Navy's Commander-in-Chief of Western Naval Command had accepted that the Pakistan Navy's latest Daphne-class submarines were far superior not only to our submarines, but also to our surface ships. Secondly, interception of Pakistan Navy's show-to-submarine broadcast had indicated that one Pakistan submarine was present and operating between Mumbai and Diu. As Diu was the assembly area for Indian Navy ships being deployed for attack on Karachi harbor, there was an urgent need to address this threat of a Pakistani submarine lurking in the region. Thirdly, owing to non-availability of sufficient anti-submarine frigates, most of which were away with the Western Fleet, Khukri and Kirpan from the Indian Navy's 14th Frigate Squadron, along with the latest seeking anti-submarine helicopters, could only be deployed on 8 December 71 to counter the threat of the Pakistani submarine operating off the Diu head. Pakistani Daphne-class submarine Hangor had sailed from Karachi on 22nd November 71 for a patrol off the Saurashtra coast. During the early morning hours of 9 December 71, she positively identified two Indian Navy ships, which were Khukri and Kirpan off the Kathiawar coast. With superior sensors and capability of Hangor, along with the added advantage that submarines have in the waters of the Indian Ocean and Arabian Sea, Hangor was able to detect Khukri and Kirpan much before the Indian warships realized the Pakistani submarine's presence in the waters. After tracking the Indian ships, Hangor launched a torpedo attack and struck Khukri with a salvo of 3 torpedoes in quick succession at 8:19 p.m. on 9 December 71 in a position 30 miles south of the Diu head. Khukri sank due to the hit from torpedoes, and as a result, 18 officers and 176 men of Khukri gave their ultimate sacrifice. This included Captain Mulla, the commanding officer who bravely chose to go down with his ship. By the time the rescue effort of Kirpan and Kachal could arrive at the scene next morning, only 6 officers and 61 sailors had survived to be rescued. This was indeed a grave loss, and important lessons were learned in respect of anti-submarine warfare operations and anti-submarine capability for the Indian Navy. Lastly, let me cover the Indian Navy's submarine operations during the 1971 war. Indian Navy's Western Naval Command was allocated 2 submarines for the 1971 operations, namely INS Kursura and INS Karanch. These were deployed on the approaches to Karachi and in appropriate patrol station off the Makran coast. The submarines were positioned ensuring that there was no overlap or mistaken identity with the Indian Navy's Western Fleet, which was also operating in the area. Kursura was on patrol from 18 November to 30th November 1971, prior to the commencement of hostilities. She was relieved in a patrol station by INS Khukri, which thereafter remained on war patrol from 3rd December to 14 December 71 and returned to Mumbai Harbour only on 28 December 1971. Kursura, therefore, was the longest deployed Indian naval unit during the 1971 conflict. From the Eastern Naval Command, INS Khanderi was deployed from 28 November to 14 December 71 to patrol in areas across the shipping route from Ceylon or Sri Lanka to Chittagong. All the submarines were tasked with the mission of destroying Pakistani Navy and merchant ships, only based on positive identification, and were to undertake patrol and surveillance in their respective regions. Analysis post the conflict concluded that the stipulation of positive identification prior to attacking any enemy ships was extremely restrictive and therefore deprived Indian Navy submarines of any real action during the 1971 Indo-Pak conflict. It can clearly be understood that submarine and anti-submarine operations are very much about grabbing the initiative. Timely and correct actions can decide the outcome of an anti-submarine warfare action and may result in the hunter becoming the hunted or vice versa. Let's hear more about these operations and events from our esteemed panelists and moderators. Jai Hind.
Wonderful to hear that, Anil, and especially for civilians like me, or what are called landlubbers, I think, right? So, so for civilians like me, it's important to understand, basic level what actually happened in that war. Shrikant, back to you.
Yeah, thank you. So we can start straight away now. The stage is set, as they say. And I'll begin asking Commodore S.N. Singh, as I was saying initially to our audiences, that you are one of those remarkable persons who was picked up from sea. Your gen form, that's like the Gazette notification says that you're picked up as a survivor at sea from INS Khukri on the 10th of December. Incidentally, sir, you also, in the run-up to the war, you were on the Brahmaputra in the Eastern Theatre. So you are amongst the few people who saw the war, the build-up to the war in the East. Then you actually experienced the war in the West. And then later on, of course, you tenanted a lot of assignments. So I don't want to talk of Khukri specifically now. We'll come to Khukri in a bit. But since you were involved in that, I just want you to tell us what was, as a young man, what was the spirit, what was the mood as the war clouds were looming? You were just getting commissioned. How was it like? What was the general mahal, so to say?
To start with, gentlemen, thank you so much for the opportunity to take part in this webinar. In March, April of 71, there were indications to us that something's going to happen with Pakistan. And the only thing is, what we didn't know was the timeline, when is it going to happen? So with that, the other thing is that we saw a lot of inductions. The Petyas had come in from the Soviet Union. The submarines had come in from the Soviet Union. The missile boats were started to come in from the Soviet Union. And also the seeking helicopters started coming in over the year. So as far as the Navy was concerned, we had a lot of new platforms which had to be meshed in to the operating SOPs, as we used to call them. And also, since the submarines, we were looking for submarines for anti-submarine warfare training over a very, very long time when we got them. So this was an opportunity for the Navy to start exploring and exploiting these submarines and our own anti-submarine warfare tactics, and start finding out problems, start fine-tuning everything with the procedures. So, and along with replenishment at sea and gunnery firings and all kinds of things. So we had, as far as the fleet is concerned, we had a very busy period. And then at the same time, the Bangladesh problem started, refugees and pressure on the government to do something. The nexus between Pakistan, China, and the US, and all the international politics laying up. So, with that background, and us having a very long period of workup, even during the monsoons, then over around July, August, we started hearing that some ships are going into, along with Vikrant, to the East Coast. And the missile boats are going to be deployed here. So we knew something is definitely going to happen. And sure enough, by July, 27th of July, with Vikrant, Brahmaputra, Beas, we took off for the East Coast, left Vikrant at Chennai, and we went on to Vizag. Then, of course, again, fueling, exercises, we were kept on the toes throughout day and night. That time in the East Coast, we didn't have a fleet commander. So Admiral Krishnan, who was the CNC, was taking personal interest in driving the ships and the two Petyas, Kamorta and Kavarati. We were really being driven by the Admiral on the East Coast. But it was throughout a very nice learning experience. And we knew definitely that something going to happen at some point in time.
Very, very nice, very learning experience. Amish, I know you got a question for AJ sir, but what SN sir has said actually ties up all these strands, training, leadership shown by Admiral Krishnan, and the trip of Vikrant, which resulted in a way in putting off the Ghazi as brought out. So I think all that adds up in his initial introductory remarks. But you go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, and one can see that one has to build up towards war. The nation, the armed forces, all have to be prepared for it. Commodore AJ Singh sir, one of the things that struck me is that India had actually acquired some submarines, in the years prior to the war, which actually many of us, at least civilians, weren't aware of, that we actually had submarines at that time. So what is the role that they played in the war? How was the capabilities impacted? How did it impact how we deployed them, what we did in our operations?
Firstly, thank you very much for giving me this honor. I consider it a privilege to have been included for this very significant event. During my tenure in London, my wife and I were very frequent visitors to the Nehru Center. And I'm absolutely delighted to renew my association with it. Thank you also very much for the kind introduction. Now, coming to your question about our submarine deployment and submarine acquisition, the Indian Navy submarine arm came into being on the 8th of December 1967. We commissioned INS Khukri, a Soviet-built Foxtrot-class submarine at Riga, the capital of Latvia, in what used to be the erstwhile Soviet Union. And as the tricolour and the naval ensign were hoisted on an Indian submarine for the first time ever, I think every Indian heart over there must have swelled with pride and warm emotion, despite the very cold and wintry morning that it was. It had been the culmination, I think, of many years of hard effort to get this critical capability for the Navy, amidst various delays that took place for one reason or another over the years, which Commodore Kesler would have more details about. The induction of INS Khukri was followed in very quick succession by 3 more similar submarines, INS Karanj, Khanderi, and Kursura. So by December 1969, we had a force level of 4 submarines. I don't think anyone could have guessed then that within 2 years, they would face a baptism, literally face a baptism by fire, and find themselves pitchforked into a full-fledged war, where the Indian Navy, which had actually been smarting from its very limited role in the 1965 war, had a point to prove not only to the enemy, but to our own national leadership as well. 3 of the 4 submarines played an active role in the war and contributed significantly to what is known as India's finest hour, Pakistan's decisive rout, and the liberation of Bangladesh in less than a fortnight in December 1971. These 4 submarines were manned at that time by the Navy's finest. The professionalism, dedication, and courage of those who manned them ensured that these boats were fully ready and primed for battle. While Kursura and Karanj were deployed on the west coast, Khanderi was deployed in the Bay of Bengal. But for whatever reasons at that time, reasons best known to the planners at that time, the submarines had been given specific orders that they could only carry out an attack after positively identifying the enemy platform. Now, this meant that they would have to come up to periscope depth and visually confirm that the target in their sights was indeed the enemy. Perhaps many merchant ships and small warships of the enemy would be grateful for this reprieve that this offered, because it prevented them from getting attacked. For a submarine, a restriction like this is akin to fighting with one arm tied behind its back, because it runs the risk of visual detection by the enemy and not only compromising its greatest asset of surprise and concealment, but also becomes vulnerable to attack. It is therefore to the credit of these brave and intrepid men who manned these boats that this constraint did not inhibit them from effectively ensuring that the enemy could not breach our maritime defenses. And I think on both the coasts, they played a very important role in ensuring that we were able to achieve total maritime dominance. The award of the Veer Chakra, the nation's 3rd highest award for gallantry to the commanding officers, was a recognition of the bravery of our submariners in that war. It is important also to understand that submarines are extremely complex and sophisticated platforms, and it takes many years of experience to optimally operate and maintain these platforms. In 1971, the Indian Navy's submarine arm was less than 4 years old. The maintenance facilities were still either practically non-existent or at best very rudimentary. Availability of spare parts was a challenge, and the crews were still honing their skills on these very demanding platforms. To be sent into battle under these circumstances tested the mettle of these crews to the extreme. It was the experience of actual combat, I think, in their early days that underlined the importance of professionalism. And if the Indian Navy's submarine arm today, 54 years later, is considered the benchmark of professional excellence, the credit for laying that strong foundation goes entirely to our pioneers. They did a remarkable job. They set very high standards for all of us to follow, and we were constantly being put to the test right through our career in the submarine arm. So that, I think, explains how these 4 submarines, despite being new to the Navy, new to submarine operations, were still able to contribute significantly to the war.
That's so nice, isn't it, Amish? I mean, you learned. We all learned so much in what he said just now, right?
Very true. And the thing is that what comes to me as a civilian is essentially what Commodore AJ Singh said. The submarine team was essentially just thrown into the fire straight away. Agni Pariksha with very little preparation, and it was almost it was our finest hour at that time. And I think that it truly, us civilians can only appreciate it when we actually know the background and the challenges through which our armed forces delivered what was actually a spectacular victory.
So, I have more questions to ask Commodore AJ, sir. But I think both our guests and you will be delighted to learn that we have a very, very special guest today. And he is someone who took part in that war. He's a submariner who was deployed there, for which he's got a Veer Chakra. We have, as a special guest, talking about what went then in the form of Admiral V.S. Shekhawat. But before I get him on, I think it's only right that I should introduce him. And with admirals, you don't want to go wrong. So even though I know, and even though while I know about his
you don't want to court martial.
I'd like to read about it. So, ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Vijay Singh Shekhawat retired from the Indian Navy on 30th September 1996 as the Chief of Naval Staff and Chairman Chiefs of Staff Committee after nearly 45 years in uniform. He was commissioned on 1st July 1956, alumnus of National Defense Academy, and 1st July 1956 is 30 years senior to me, as the best all-round cadet and the President's Gold Medalist. So he's the record, I think, for having maximum blues in a range of sporting events in the NDA. So he's traveled extensively, regular participants in seminars on national and international issues in India and abroad, and he's addressed all the leading institutions, whether it's NDC, DSSC, the College of Naval Warfare, USI. Now, hold it here. You must also know that he's a very keen mountaineer. In fact, he's completed both the basic and advanced courses at the Himalayan Mountaineering Institute, Darjeeling. He's a member of successful 1961 Indian expedition to Annapurna, Nepal, and he has climbed extensively in the United Kingdom and is an invited member of the Indian Mountaineering Federation. So his early life before the submarines, he was on surface ships, but he's a pioneer submariner. That means he trained in the UK in the early 60s, and then when the UK deal fell through and we got submarines from Russia, erstwhile Soviet Union, he trained there. He was the commissioning crew of the first submarine, the Kalvari. Then he went as the commissioning XO of the third one, which is the Karanj, as the XO. And then he was a commanding officer of Karanj during the 71 war. So that is why when recently the Karanj was commissioned, he was the chief guest, the second one. So he's sailed submarines. He's had extensive time in all the submarines. Later on, he commanded an ASW frigate, Himgiri, which incidentally had the best ASW equipment at that time. So he did both the anti-submarine warfare and submarine cadet. He's taught at the National Defense Academy. He was later the deputy commandant there. He's attended the U.S. Naval College in Newport, very prestigious. He was awarded, as we said, the Veer Chakra for gallantry. Later, the AVSM and the PVSM. In the flag rank, he was the ACNS operations in Naval Headquarters. He looked after the entire Navy's operations. He was the director of ship system development, and he was also involved in defense planning. That means all the three services, Director General Defense Planning Staff. He was the fleet commander of the Western Fleet in the mid-80s during the Operation Brass Tacks. And in the rank of Vice Admiral, he was a flag officer commanding in chief the Eastern Naval Command in 1991-92, and the Vice Chief of Naval Staff from 1992 to 93, before becoming the Naval Chief, assuming the office of Chief of Naval Staff on 1st October 1993. After retirement also, he spent an active time as a member of the National Security Advisory Board for 2 terms, and even now I know for a fact that in Bombay, he's very active in a lot of maritime history initiatives and forums, and gives some wonderful guidance to lots of people. Very, very active, very fit, in his late 80s, you would think that he's a youngster just who's 18. So that's Admiral Shekhawat for us. Let's listen to what he has to say about the 1971 war.
When war broke out, the first submarine Calvary was under refit and unable to go to sea. The second submarine Khanderi was long overdue for refit, had exceeded her battery life and had very high hydrogen evolution and was barely able to operate. The third submarine Karanj, which I commanded, had been in a collision the previous year with a destroyer Ranjit and had been under extensive repairs with replacement of periscope, damaged fin, damaged casing. And when I took over and completed the process of repairs in the Naval Dockyard in Bombay, first of all, because the collision had taken place on the west coast, sailed her across to the east coast, Visakhapatnam, and completed those repairs. So she had also consumed a considerable amount of her battery cycle. The inexpert repairs by the commercial shipyard had resulted in problems of high pressure air leaking out very, very rapidly. And of course, the shortage of crews. So that was really the situation at that time. Kursara, the fourth submarine, was more or less in a satisfactory operational state. And so both our submarines were deployed from Mumbai, then Bombay, for operations in the North Arabian Sea. We were sent out on patrol by rotation, and as it happened, when the war broke out, I was actually out on patrol having relieved Kursura. And she was due for a maintenance cycle, so she came in, and the only operational submarine, fully operational submarine, was under a maintenance period. And so Karanj was the one that eventually deployed. Now, the North Arabian Sea in the winter months, that is in December, has certain peculiar conditions which are adverse for submarines. This water is generally calm. The visibility is extremely good. There are lots of layers of sound layers, which affect the propagation of sound. And there is a phenomenon which I was to discover during the course of the deployment called upwelling, in which the cold water moving up on the floor of the Arabian Sea hits the steep Makran coast and rises up, bringing up with it lots of marine organisms, nutrients, fish, and also, of course, a mass of cold water. Also, there is a lot of bioluminescence due to this marine organisms being present. And so at night as well, in the calm, clear water, even a submarine which is dived at a reasonable depth will leave a glowing trail to be easily sighted from the air by a patrolling aircraft. So these were the adverse aspects of the North Arabian Sea environment in that time of the year. Nevertheless, we were deployed, and I was at sea when the orders came to proceed to a certain waiting station off the Makran coast, and I proceeded there. And having first checked out all the systems on board, carried out a deep dive, and I was satisfied that as far as safety was concerned, we were completely confident of all the systems being fully functional. There were limitations, of course, as I mentioned, of the battery and the high pressure air, and we occupied our station. There were naturally many contacts detected and targets which were at a distance. And the complicating factor was the presence of foreign navies which had participated in a major exercise called Exercise Midlink, which involved, I think, the US Navy, the UK, Iran, and Pakistani forces. So these were lingering in that area. And orders that we had been given were they were very restrictive. We were free to attack Pakistani warships if we could identify them, and merchant vessels only if positively identified as Pakistani. Now, that's more or less an impossibility for a submarine. In the Second World War, there were many submarines that went through 5 years of submarine operations without ever being able to carry out a torpedo attack because there were simply no targets. And that was somewhat the situation that we encountered. And even though we had merchant ships, and one of them I even sighted through my periscope at shallow depth, going away without any flag or marker, any port of registry, nothing. And there was no way I could say it was Pakistani. And I could even read her name, Glory, but I simply had to let her go. There was another occasion when, if I had had more experience myself and better awareness of the methods of the Pakistan Navy, a possible target. One evening when I surfaced quite close to the Pakistan coast, in the twilight I spotted 2 white vessels, very similar to the coastal passenger vessels that we used to have on our coast flying there, small. And I immediately dived, but because of the environmental conditions that I had mentioned, I could not see them through the periscope due to the low haze. I could not hear them because of the sonar glare that was existing at the surface. And I did not want to risk radar operation because they appeared to be passenger vessels heading west moreover. It was some 35 years later, I learned from a Pakistani senior naval officer that those days their minesweepers used to be painted white. And so therefore, in a sense, they would have been legitimate targets. But the operating conditions did not permit me to identify them positively. And also, I was carrying a number of material problems. The main exhaust blower had packed up. The batteries were low and required charging. The high pressure air was low and required charging. So I had to withdraw into deeper waters to do all that overnight. And if I had been more confident that they were legitimate targets, I think I would have certainly come back to locate them again. Roughly these were our, yes, there was also a nuclear submarine that we encountered at some distance north of us, heading at a fairly high speed westward. And I was able to identify her as a nuclear submarine. Of course, they were not a threat to us, we were not belligerents. But afterwards, when I returned to harbor, I was able to establish that she was probably the USS Skate, though other reports described her as USS Sargo, possibly having taken part in the mid-link exercises and still lingering in the area. So that's as far as the deployment operations were concerned. At the end of it all, we of course did not have a target at which we fired, though there were opportunities. But there was considerable positive spin-offs for the submarines from that deployment. First of all, we were able to gain complete confidence in our equipment and fully understand its limitations and work within those limitations without compromising safety. Secondly, the crew was able to acquire a fair amount of experience and displayed the confidence for the command in their skill levels and their ability to handle all situations, as well as carry out very major level repairs on board, which would normally be done in the dockyards, such as the dismounting and reassembling and overhauling of the main exhaust blower, which is a very, very heavy piece of equipment. And I think most importantly, from the operational point of view, the presence of the submarine which incidentally their Pakistan radio broadcast as having sunk an Indian naval submarine, which was, of course, caused some degree of concern back home, but which was a completely fabricated broadcast. We were able to confine the Pakistan Navy by sheer presence into their harbors and secure base. So following the attack by the missile boats on the 4th of December and on the 7th of December, which had in any case caused considerable consternation and panic within the Pakistan Navy, the presence of a submarine further restricted their movements. So really speaking, no Pakistani warships came out to sea after those two attacks. And that is, I think, the main takeaway as far as submarine operations are concerned, to by sheer presence in a certain area to achieve an objective of confining the enemy to his own port.
Fascinating. Shrikant, the Admiral would, in the private sector, not just be called an overachiever, but a hyperachiever. That's a private sector terminology. Commodore AJ Singh will understand that. Commodore SN Singh, sir, if I can, if I can ask you, if you can come to the Khukri, I know it may be a difficult story for you, but you joined Khukri, and if you can take us through what happened on that fateful night of 9 December, the sad, poignant events that happened. If you can just take us through what happened, sir.
On the 9th of December 1971, I was on the first watch, which is which starts at 7:45 in the evening. And since we were at action stations, that means the complete ship was closed up for action. And what the system we are following is that every 4 hours, everyone gets into action stations. And then after about 15-20 minutes, there's an announcement which is made called Action Stations Relaxed. That gives the existing people who were on duty, gives them a chance to go freshen up, have a meal, relax a bit. And the moment any action starts, any announcement is made, they immediately get onto the action stations. The time taken is about 3 to 4 minutes minimum. Maximum 4 to 5 minutes, and the entire ship is on action stations at that. There are other stations, other degrees of readiness, which without getting into those. So in our case, we were throughout at action stations or action stations relaxed. From the time we got into the area which the Navy knew the submarine was operating in. How we got to know was because of the intelligence and the pickup of the submarine transmissions that she was making. So the Navy knew more or less quite accurately where the submarine is. So there were two ships, Khukri and Kirpan, who were in the area searching for the submarine. And that particular night, at about 8:30, Captain was having a meeting on the bridge for firstly to decide. Now, again, I have to go back a bit into history. We had an experimental sonar which had been installed on board. We had come into Bombay on the 6th of December because Kuthar, one of our sister ships, had a boiler explosion. So we had to, along with Kirpan, we had to, Kirpan towing Kuthar and Khukri had to escort her. So these 3 ships had come back to Bombay. And that's the time when this experimental sonar was installed on board. And the powers that be decided that in a wartime situation, they had to go ahead with the experimental sonar to be installed. So be it. So it was installed on board. And yes, so from the time we left harbor, which is on the 8th of December, Khukri and Kirpan, we sent out for the area which was off due. So, and on board Khukri, throughout the discussions were how to exploit this experimental sonar. All it gave us was a very extended ranges. Our actual sonar was, I'm sorry, Mr. Tripathi, I'll have to go into a bit of technicalities.
No,
which,
please, sir.
you know,
If I don't understand, sir, if I don't understand, I'll ask you. But if I make one request, sir, you're my senior. Please don't call me Mr. Tripathi, Amish, sir. I'm
okay.
younger. Just Amish.
Okay. Right.
Yes, sir.
So throughout the discussions, how to exploit the sonar, it was a very nice thing. It gave us extended ranges. But in the case of a wartime scenario, and especially when there are 2 ships, you're prosecuting a submarine, you know very well it's there. So these discussions would go on for some time.
Yeah.
And
Commodore SN Singh, sir, if just for my just for the civilian audiences, sonar, please correct me if I'm wrong. Sonar is essentially what's on a ship, through which it's like a radar, right? And you
yeah, but it's underwater.
can check if there's anything else.
Yeah, basically it's an underwater. It's an underwater radar.
Yes, sir.
Very simply put.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Right.
Please
Only
go
thing
ahead.
is that this particular underwater radar has got too many kind of deviations of the ray of the beam, etc., etc.
Fair.
All kinds of dramas take place. That's why there is a specialization in the Navy word called anti-submarine warfare specialist. Right. So these discussions were going on, and then we knew that we cannot go into a higher speed because of the fact that our noise of our own transducers and things reduces the range. So what we were doing is speed around 10 to 12 knots, 8 to 12 knots, so that we reduce our own noise, we get some range, and exploit the sonar. These discussions were going on, and that particular evening, and of course, as throughout that wartime, 8:45 in the evening, there used to be that 5 minutes capsule news on India Radio in English, followed by Hindi, 5 minutes. And I, for myself, I had taken over watch, as I said, 7:45. So like the, under trainee watch, midshipman put on a ship's position, speed, course, formation, etc., note it all down. And then looking around, pretty cold that day, December, off the Saurashtra coast. And then the news came And within about minutes of the that announcement, saying now I hand over to the Hindi news, and that's when the first torpedo hit. Now, that time we didn't know it was a torpedo initially, but all that happened was that there was this huge explosion underwater directly under the keel, and I was almost thrown from the bridge, almost banged my head. Captain got hurt, and the ship was almost chucked upwards vertically, then down, and started disting actually to the starboard side. That's to the right side. Lights went off, emergency lanterns came on, and pitch dark, because in any case we didn't have any lights showing outside. We had darkened ship going on, and there was that momentary as to what's happened. Captain knew immediately what's happened. A few of the other officers, the navigator, the SCO, etc., they knew what's happened, because they knew that they are in a submarine area, and somebody is bound to take action. So, from the first hit, we kept listing more and more to starboard, total darkness, very few emergency lanterns, and the ship kept then listing, and then the bows started coming up. And the captain started telling the guys, Chalo, niklo, save yourself, told the XO, take a look, get the ship's company off. I tried to make the announcement, hands to abandon ship, hands to abandon ship, but there was no broadcast system working at that time. So in the 3 to 4 minutes that the ship continued tilting to the starboard side, and then the bows started coming up, and the men started jumping, some on the starboard side, very few to the port side, because that was the higher side. I looked around, the captain was there on the bridge. He didn't say anything in the last of the moments, and because almost everyone had left the bridge. There was one of the communication sailors, I think he was with me. Two of us, I jumped off the port side. Some of the sailors jumped from the port side. Mostly the sailors who survived jumped from the starboard side. And in about 5 minutes, the bows were up and coming down. By the time I jumped from the bridge, I jumped in about 4 feet or 3 feet of water. That much of the ship had already gone. And then, of course, got into the water. There was pitch darkness. There was very little sound, very little, after the initial 2 explosions. There was one explosion, and then there was another one, second torpedo explosion. And then I got into the water. Then there were these sailors, they were shouting to each other, which either safed cheese had. So obviously that was a life raft. So I told the chap, "Khecho, ek rassi hogi, usko khecho." So of course the aircraft inflated. Then, of course, gradually got into the raft. Then there were people shouting still, "Bachao, bachao!" But since yes, there was some shouts coming. It was so cold at that time. Secondly, everybody was so full of oil because our own oil had kind of spread all over this area. And that furnace fuel oil, it's something I wish nobody can ever drink or taste it. But I tasted it, I drank it. And I wouldn't like to do it again. And eyes were full of that oil, So there's very little that anyone could do to help anybody else. But then, of course, there were people who were, helping them getting onto the raft or getting something on, so that you could, get on further, something to save yourself. So then, of course, we finally organized, our getting into the raft, because firstly, with everyone full of oil, getting into the raft was quite an experience, quite an exercise, because there was no way you could get onto a raft normally. Everything was oily. So somehow everyone got in, head one, head two people got one in and things like that. Then we realized that now I was outside the raft, was helping some of the guys get in. And I realized that there's the canopy which inflates to give you a cover on the raft. Now, all the sailors had got onto the canopy. So I told these guys, no, you have to get out first. So they got out, then the thing inflated. And then, again, started the exercise of getting onto the raft. But then, of course, on that is another part of the story. But then, of course, we managed to somehow survive. I had a particular sailor with me. He was in my raft, who was obviously a watchkeeper in one of the boiler rooms, or maybe the turbine control room. When I first saw him, he was full of oil, like anybody else. Then, when he, kind of got into the raft itself, it's saying, "Bada bahut dard ho rahi hai," So I realized, not now, but after some time, this after about 4 or 5 hours, that his skin had actually, if you tear off a full-sleeved shirt from the cuff, his skin was in tatters like that. Both the arms, his back, because this was that super saturated steam at 800 degrees centigrade. The pipe must have burst, or something must have burst. And that chap was screaming initially. Then, of course, we gave him water, and of course, he survived. But it was some experience in, to see a person in that kind of a condition. Of course, next morning, we were picked up by Kirpan. The other officers and sailors were picked up by Kachan. And then, of course, that's when the Genform got made, not for the 10th, but it was made for the 14th, when we were landed ashore to Andre.
How many of the sailors survived, sir?
Totally, we had 61 sailors out of 242. Okay. 25 officers and 242 sailors were on board, out of which 6 officers and 61 sailors survived.
And Captain Mulla, sir, he went down with the.
Yeah, he went down. And somehow of course, I had, because of the fact that there were just 2 midshipmen, out of which one, again, a very sad story, midshipman Patil. He had, when Khukri, Kirpan, Kuthar came back to Bombay on the 6th of December, he had hurt his knee. So he went to Ashwini and said, listen, very bad knee, what do I do and things. So they said, sorry, on the beds we have kept vacant for wartime injuries. So you finish off with your war and come back and we'll sort you out. So he remained on board the ship without being able to do any watchkeeping, etc. And when, of course, that's where fate works. Now, again, we were together for the midshipmen's board. And we had come from Brahmaputra. So this guy says, listen, one of the other officers who had fainted in the mid's board on Khukri. So this Patil says, yeah, why don't you come along with me? We got a nice set of officers and things. I said, yeah, fine, let's go. So I actually volunteered to go on board.
Okay.
Of course, this the crew, the officers were very, very nice. But it just so happened that, there's a kind of something when this has to happen, it just happens.
It has. Amish, the thing about Commodore SN Singh's, I've heard this description sometime before too, but he says it in such a deadpan manner, but that brings out the entire drama, the poignancy. I mean, it's matter of fact, but that every bit, whether it is telling how they got into the water, how the explosion happened, the atmosphere, the darkness, the sailors' condition, getting the leadership that you show even in a life raft and getting people in and out, the whole kismat or karma in the way people's, there's huge amount of drama in the way he describes many of these things. But just before you ask the next question, or before I ask, since you made a couple of points, the two clarifications. One is sonar, as he said, is an underwater radar. Radar uses radio waves to assist in detection, and sonar uses sound. So there are certain different complexities associated with that, which gives, particularly in our warm waters, it gives a different sort of perspective to the way whole of this undersea warfare is conducted, which is why, as SN sir said, there is the anti-submarine warfare specialization, and there's submariners like Commodore AJ Singh who pit their wits against these ASW people on the fleet ship. Secondly, midshipmen they're like interns, like just as the intern doctors make these notes and all that. So like that, the midshipman in watch is supposed to come there before, make all notes, fix the position of the ship, do everything to earn his graduation after the midship board. So these are 2 points of explanation. So, sir, AJ sir, I just wanted to ask you. I mean, you've been submarine captain, you've been a warrior on the prowl, so to say. You experienced all these things, So, what goes on in the mind of a submarine CEO at such times? I mean, here, of course, decidedly, probably the Pakistani submarine had decisive advantage, and Khukri and Kuthar didn't probably have the best of equipment, or they were not the most modern at that time. But generally speaking, you have now seen how submarine warfare has evolved. If you could talk of complexities of warfare, bring out a little bit of what Amish said, complexities of undersea warfare, and what goes on in the mind of a submarine captain during such moments, and his challenges.
Before I get down to that, let me also just narrate that you spoke very highly of Admiral Shekhawat, the hyper-achiever. But I was in my 5th term at NDA at the National Defence Academy, when we heard that we are getting this very awesome naval officer as the next deputy commandant. And he was, then a captain, and I think he'd just become a Commodore V.S. Shekhawat. And of course, his reputation preceded him, 6 blues and mountaineer and President's Gold Medalist and just about everything that a cadet could do and more, he had done. And then in our 6th term, when we returned after the term break, we came across this new deputy commandant, ramrod straight, still wearing his cadets, fitting into cadets blazer, 25 years into the Navy with all the 6 blues below the crest of the NDA as in the NDA. So we were all just very impressed. And then when we saw him in uniform, all of us, looked at that badge he was wearing. And so I still remember asking somebody, I said, what badge is that? And they said, it's the badge of the submarine arm. It's the Dolphins. And, I think it is things like this which probably subconsciously shape a young naval officer or a young cadet's mind. And that's where the genesis of my volunteering with submarine probably originated. And, as you know, and perhaps your listeners might like to know, the submarine arm is an entirely voluntary arm. Nobody can be forced to join the submarine arm. Everyone volunteers for it, and only those who volunteer and then qualify the medicals, etc., join the arm after that. So that I thought was just an aside. But that's the kind of respect and regard that we all hold Admiral Shekhawat in, particularly amongst the submariners. Coming back to your question, submarines, by the very nature of their construction and, of course, the complexity of the operating medium underwater, many fathoms below the surface, are inherently dangerous. But, we in the arm often say, and this used to be the opening line of our standing orders in the good old days, I don't know if it's still followed, that submarines are dangerous only when we forget that they're dangerous. And so what I try to say is that there is a lot of emphasis laid more on ensuring that each and every crew member is thoroughly professional in his area of expertise. At sea, you'll find commanding officers are constantly practicing their crews in offensive operations, attack procedures, damage control drills, adherence to the standard operating procedures on board, till all these actions become second nature and instinctive when reacting to an adverse situation on board. That notwithstanding, the very nature of the platform does, of course, lead to tricky situations at times. And I think it is here that the professionalism of each and every crew member on board is tested, because there is practically no room for error. One man's mistake can take the entire submarine down to a very watery grave. I'm in fact reminded of a line from Rear Admiral Ronald Hopwood's famous Laws of the Navy, which we all read as young officers and young midshipmen, where he said, and I quote, "On the strength of one link in the cable dependent the might of the chain. Who knows when thou'st may be tested? So live that thou bearest the strain." This has been one of the sort of things we've tried to follow in our career in the Navy, particularly in the submarines. But coming to your other part of what would have been in the minds of the CEOs on that during the war, particularly, operating submarines, literally pitchforked into the battle. I'm sure that the restrictions that were placed on the submarines that they could attack only after positively identifying the enemy must have been a very frustrating experience. The Pakistan Navy had been dealt critical body blows at the beginning of the war itself. The sinking of the submarine PNS Ghazi of Visakhapatnam on the night of 1st and 2nd December itself, and subsequently the devastating missile boat attacks a few days later, which inflicted great damage with the loss of a destroyer and a minesweeper in one night itself. Had the submarines been perhaps deployed more aggressively, they could have delivered the coup de grace to the Pakistani war effort militarily, and even choked the country economically by preventing any shipping from reaching Pakistani ports. However, despite these restrictions which were placed on our submarines, they were still very effective in deterring any adventurism by the Pak Navy, with the submarine threat mainly responsible for confining their ships in harbor. Coming to the second part of your question, submarines have to deal not only with the complexities of the undersea environment, but they also have to counter and get the better of a multi-dimensional naval effort which is ranged against them. There are aircrafts and helicopters with anti-submarine sensors and weapons constantly on the prowl for submarines. There are large and powerful surface warships bristling with weapons and sensors how to detect and destroy submarines. And of course, submarines themselves in an anti-submarine role are a submarine's biggest enemy. Modern autonomous technologies, network-centric operations, the increasing use of the space and cyber domains is all transforming the maritime battle space and also reshaping the underwater environment. Autonomous underwater vehicles of various sizes now are being developed by most navies worldwide, and they're being developed in various sizes with various capabilities, and are often modular in construction to be able to perform a variety of kinetic and non-kinetic actions in the depths of the oceans. And supported by the development of quantum technologies now, this is set to effect a further transformation in how the undersea warfare environment is going to shape up in the years to come.
Commodore AJ Singh, just to simplify that, that's a bit like, I'm sorry, I'm using civilian terms that people understand. Will be a bit like drones underwater, right? So there are no
That is
manually.
That is correct.
It's
These are
controlled by
more
remote
than
from
drones
outside,
because
so therefore
yeah.
capabilities expand dramatically at very little risk to our men.
Yes, it's taking the man, like we always say, it's taking the man out of the loop. But
Right.
these, this gives a lot of versatility to the navy operating underwater, particularly when you're looking for submarines, and is a very effective force multiplier in the current environment.
Right.
So they are going to make a lot of difference to the maritime battle space. But for submarines specifically, operating below the surface for months on end in a confined space within a narrow steel cylinder with absolutely no exposure to the external environment, and from which there is practically no escape in an emergency, can be both physiologically and mentally challenging. Added to that is the requirement to be constantly alert, because as I said earlier, there is no room for error. At times, we have serious machinery failures and defects on various systems, which can further place a crew under great strain. However, the proliferation of submarines worldwide and their safe operations clearly testifies to the resilience of the human body and mind, which obviously can effectively cope with all these challenges that are thrown in a person's way.
True.
Here, I would also like to clear a misconception that submariners can look out and see the wonders of marine life. This question was often asked. Even my mother asked me this question when I joined.
So you can't blame us because everyone's seen James Bond movies, and we assume that's
but in actual fact, a submarine is an enclosed steel cylinder with no means of looking outside when dived deep, and crews could be submerged for a few months at a time without seeing either night or day. So that sort of encapsulates the challenge that commanding officers have, in a way, of having to keep a crew motivated for months on end, for the crew to be able to give out their best, be constantly alert, and still at the end of it maintain that camaraderie despite a very close working environment. People could get on each other's nerves very fast, but that it doesn't happen, I think, speaks volumes for the kind of people who man submarines.
very tight, confined space. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think, Amish, the submariners are a special breed, to be able to stand that kind of claustrophobia, to be there together, to live in that artificial environment. You really got to be someone super special, to be that. And leadership challenges, Commander Audito, Admiral Audito later, he talks during this deployment for the war. He was deployed off Pakistan first, and then Admiral Shekhawat replaced him. That he talks about how he collected the latest music tapes and CDs from the Navy band, from Rhythm House and all that, and he could play it continuously on this one, and it had to be still done in a very discreet way to ensure that submarine doesn't radiate noise. But so you have to do lots of things, maybe card games, maybe caroms, but these are great people and with unique leadership challenges. But talking of leadership, let's go back to now Commodore SN Singh and ask him about Captain Mulla. I think, as far as we are concerned, he's a legend. He epitomized leadership and sacrifice. But you've seen him firsthand, so we'd like you to tell us a little bit about your experiences of Captain Mulla, what you had heard, what you saw, and subsequently what followed.
It's very strange that My exposure to Captain Mulla was maybe 10 hours, maybe 15 hours for the number of days that I spent, considering 26th of November to the 8th or say 9th of December. But two things. Firstly, he had a very stern face, very stern face. His visage was very stern, right? But the moment you asked him, like, on a bridge, initially I would not even ask, if the officer of the watch is there, I'd ask him rather than, ask if he's not there, if he's doing something else. I have to ask Captain something, right? So even then I would, try and say, tell the signalman ke wo saab ko officer of the watch se kaho aayenge jaldi se. Then I realized there was a harm. So first, once I know we were raising a diet or something, so I turned and said, "Sir, raised so diet." All right. Man of very few words. But again, there's some issues that were getting discussed. He was always there. Again, especially tactical issues, he was always there. Sonar, not to transmit, or what kind of all kinds of things. He was always there. Then any minor problem with any of the sailors, I understand he had given one of the sailors a personal loan. Because the rules didn't permit thing. The guy says, "Okay, don't worry, I'm giving you the money, pay it back to me." He did those kinds of things also. So, a very human-hearted person, very stern visage, and next, minor problems, rations, etc. Couldn't be bothered about these minor issues running of the ship. I mean, I've seen CEOs, who would get into it, no, why are you doing this kind of a thing? Captain Mulla couldn't be bothered. Minor things, EXOs there and the heads of departments are there. Please don't disturb me. I've got enough on my plate. But I mean, I wish I'd seen and interacted more with him. Especially at daytime, nighttime, whatever time, the tactical situations. That fishing boats cutting across the ships and things. He wouldn't bother. You take one look. If I've given, say, steer 230 or something, you turn and say, steady, and he would insist, just stay on that course. He was always right. I mean, I saw physically one of the fishing boats passing, must be about 50 yards or 100 yards ahead. But he didn't alter course. Because especially that time when we were towing, when Kirpan was towing Kuthar and, fishing, we were entering Bombay. And we had those, for restricted in movement, the navigation lights for all three ships. He insisted, he said, nothing doing. So, a very good person to have to be on board. The sailors swore by him.
The sailors swore by him.
Wonderful difference.
If I can ask, sir, at the last moment, because you were on the bridge, you saw him. and he asked all of you, to abandon ship, and didn't say anything. And, he knew. What was he like on those last few moments when I guess he decided that he'll go down with the ship?
I think he had no expression on his face. That's what I'm saying, that somehow it made me believe that he knew that it's best if he does not come out with. The highest traditions of the Navy, that the captain goes down, is exactly what he did.
Yeah. Stoic. Yeah.
Very stoic, very stoic. And
Commodore AJ Singh, sorry, sir. Sorry, sir. Please go ahead.
No, nothing. I mean, whatever you can read about him, it's true.
Commodore AJ Singh, sir, you joined after the war. How did your generation see Captain Mulla?
No, I was a schoolboy during the war. In fact, I returned home from boarding school for the winter vacations the day the war began. And of course, it was very exciting for us with blackouts and air raid sirens and all the rest of all the bells and whistles that go with it. And as an army brat, my father was in the army, and also with many friends, also from a military background. The war was never very far from home. Family members, uncles, cousins were fighting on the front. Anxiety about them was therefore a constant at home, and a frequent topic of discussion. Also, I must confess that in landlocked North India, the naval action did not grab as much attention as the Army's exploits or the Air Force daredevilry. But the sinking of the Khukri and Captain Mulla's extraordinary act of bravery and conviction in going down with his ship, because he believed it was the right thing to do, I think grabbed national attention like nothing else, and mine as well. It is often believed that the loss of a warship, and this has been borne out in history, strikes a debilitating, sort of psychological blow to a navy in wartime. The sinking of the General Belgrano in the Falklands War of 1982 by the British submarine HMS Conqueror led to Argentina ordering all its warships back to harbor, and they stayed there for the remainder of that war. Incidentally, my Argentinian counterpart, when I was the naval advisor in London, was a midshipman survivor of the General Belgrano, and he used to also recounted the how it sank. And Commodore S.N. Singh, I had the privilege of being with him as a student officer when he was the SI in Staff College in Wellington. So here I've actually interacted with two survivors of an actual sinking in a proper full-fledged war, which in itself is it's a learning experience to hear how they dealt with it or what exactly transpired. But in 1971, actually, if you look at the 1971 war itself, the initial loss of Pakistani warships and the presence of Indian submarines also kept the Pakistani fleet in harbor, much like what happened with the Argentinians later in the Falklands. However, if you realize, the loss of the Khukri had quite the opposite effect, and the Indian Navy went on to decisively dominate the complete maritime theater of operations from the Arabian Sea to the Bay of Bengal. And this, I believe, and I've over the years, and I'm even more convinced, was in no small measure due to the valor of the Khukri crew and the personal leadership example that was set by its captain. In the years since then also, his has been the inspiration, I think, for successive generations of naval personnel. And even though 50 years have elapsed since then, and there have been many acts of courage and daring, I think Captain Mulla's sacrifice is still spoken of with great awe and reverence. So I think that defines how we, who joined the Navy much after the war, and even for present generations, that defines how we view the sinking of the Khukri and the extraordinary courage of its captain.
Amish, I joined a few years later, but I entirely sort of go along with what Commodore AJ Singh says. I mean, it became a lodestar. It was in terms of bravery, courage, in terms of certain moral action, so you could say, not just tactical action. This was the lodestar by which we set our standards. And I think Commodore AJ brings out another very important point, that when the Indian Navy went and dominated, inspired by the deeds of Khukri and her captain. So we didn't stop. The war business was prosecuted to achieve whatever our ultimate objectives were. I think that's a very important point. But what we also do now is to hear from someone who was in a way affected by that. We have another special guest with us today, and she's going to be telling us what it was as a family of someone who went down in the Khukri. We've been speaking about Captain Mulla, the great legend, the very courageous Mahavir Chakra winner. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we have Amita Mulla Vatal, the daughter of late Captain Mulla. She will be telling us what she went through. But before that, Amish, you might like to sort of introduce Amita ma'am.
Yes, if I may, sorry, got a little emotional listening to it.
Yeah.
Dr. Amita Vatal is a PhD in creative classrooms. Dr. Amita Mulla Vatal is currently the chairperson and executive director, education, innovations and training, DLF Foundation Schools and Scholarship Programs. She was the former principal, Springdale School, Pusa Road and Kirti Nagar in New Delhi. She is on the Ministerial Consultation on Education for National Commission for Protection of Child Rights at the Niti Aayog. She is the lead member of Global Education Leaders Program, a consortium of 63 countries sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Asian Education Foundation. She's a recipient of the prestigious National Teachers Award from the President of India, Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam. Clearly a legend in the education space. If we can hear from her, please.
It is indeed an honor and a privilege to be speaking on this platform. For this, I would like to thank the Indian Navy, which my mother and our family have always considered to be our home, Commodore Kesnoor and the director, Mr. Amish Tripathi. I've considered myself to be a Khukri survivor. Survivor stories never make history, nor good copy. In fact, they become collateral damage in a war best forgotten, which has been won. These years that go by flash across me in my mind, and I think of the 14-year war in which millions of lives were affected. A new nation was born, and my mother and I and my sister never had a closure because my father's body never came back. I spoke to my uncle at the time, Mr. R.N. Kao, the chief of the RAW, and he said that you don't ever disturb a sleeping battleship. But in a sense, I do believe that my father came back, because when I got married at the age of 18, I remember that there were 3 Khukri survivors who walked into our home and gave a gift to my mother and said that they had come for their captain's daughter. In fact, they sat with my mother throughout the Kanyadan, and I would say that my father had come back through them. As the years have gone by, I can only think of the lines of the Casabianca, which says, "With mast and helm and pen and fair that well had borne their part, the noblest thing that perished there were those young and faithful hearts." In 1971, December, my father was tasked with finding, hunting, and destroying a Pakistani sophisticated Daphne submarine. He was in charge of some vintage frigates. Unfortunately, the INS Khukri became a victim of that Pakistani submarine. It sank, taking with it 178 ratings and 18 officers, including my father, who was awarded the Mahavir Chakra posthumously. It is mentioned that the captain showed extraordinary courage. He tried to help as many as he could, but he did not abandon his ship. I've always wondered, why did my father go down with that ship? Did he go down because he wanted to be immortalized in history books? Did he go down because he had grown up in an archaic naval tradition of the Royal Navy, where he was commissioned? Did he go down because that was the only thing to do and the right thing to do? My sister and I had come back in December for our winter vacations from boarding school. And I remember so clearly that on the 5th of December, the Ack guns which lit up the night sky in Bombay were watched by us with glee from the balcony of Navy Nagar. To us, images of war and death were merely pictures that we saw in the United Services Club. But that auditorium had exits. The torpedo that hit INS Khukri was not scripted. And the war that took place had no exits. I remember that my mother was given weak assurances that my father was saved and would come back to her. But she said that he will never, ever put his safety first in front of his men, and he would never return. My father was not a penny in the slot hero. In fact, when he and his crew went out to hunt that submarine, I'm sure they were aware of the dangers, as are all men who go out to war. And I'm convinced that in those 3 minutes when the torpedo struck Khukri, he was aware that an entire lot of his boys were trapped in the bowels of the ship and were alive. This answers that question. Why did he go down with the ship? There was no question when his boys were trapped and were doomed, would he ever forsake them? Would he ever abandon them? He has become a symbol for many in the future, for the way they live their lives and their actions. In fact, I think all service personnel who have commanded men during war know that special bond that exists between them and their men. They go out there, they fight to the best of their abilities. They fight the enemy, but they never leave men behind under their command. My father showed exemplary courage. He showed character. He showed bravery. He showed resilience. And he showed a never say die attitude, which was a symbol of how he had been raised and disciplined in the service on that day. To many people, the loss of Khukri was a battle casualty that was often discussed in naval circles, particularly as to the reasons why it went down. But to me, he was perhaps the greatest win that the Navy had of the human spirit, a spirit of a man who showed so much courage in the face of the enemy, so much courage that he tried to save as many men as he could. And on realizing that he could do no further, he went and sat down on that captain's chair as if to tell his men and the boys in the bowels of his ship that I am your father, I will never leave you. He became an icon for millions of people, for millions of service personnel who came after him. Jai Hind, Jai Bharat.
Thank you, ma'am. Amish, that was very moving, right? And every time we go through these emotions, and in a sense, when Amita ma'am had sort of, I think, written about this many years ago, and at that time there was a fantastic response. Of course, that response by way of internet took a few years. Written by a serving Navy officer, not serving, a retired Navy officer called Commander Alan Rodrigues, who sort of responded to Amita ma'am, explaining his own reasons about why Captain Mulla went down. And I think the key thing he said is that the message Captain Mulla sent out is, you never forsake your men, you never leave them behind. The knowledge that there were a few people on board the ship was enough to make Captain Mulla sort of, stay there and go down. So you never forsake your men. That's the biggest lesson we learned from there. So now, but let us turn our action to the Eastern Theatre, where I think, AJ sir, you brought about how the Indian Navy stayed active, and one reason was that we had lured the Ghazi to her doom, so to say, through some very good deception measures, through some proactive ASW, and so before and keeping the fleet away. So our fleet had freedom of action by the sinking of Ghazi. So I'd like both of you to weigh in. You had very rich careers. You've studied this battle, and through your own experiences, how important was that action and the consequent benefit of that for fleet? How the luring of Ghazi, and how do you see all that play out?
I think it was firstly, I think on the part of the Pakistan Navy, it was a very daring move to deploy a World War II vintage 10th class submarine all the way from Karachi to the Indian East Coast port of Visakhapatnam. But the target in sight was INS Vikrant, which was perhaps in the Pakistan Navy's view, India's naval center of gravity. And they perhaps felt that if they could get the Vikrant, that would be the end of the Indian Navy as far as the war went. However, Ghazi, it must have been under tremendous strain after that long passage of about 3,000 miles. We mustn't forget, we're talking about a submarine of World War II vintage with very elementary technology, with difficult living conditions on board, and having to do such a long passage, and thereafter being deployed right at the mouth of the enemy's harbor with frenetic naval activity in progress, and thereafter also being forced to remain concealed, must definitely have told on her crew, on her captain, on her material state. And I think ultimately she succumbed to this kind of pressure through a combination of both. It was the Indian Navy's relentless presence, which must have kept her under tremendous strain, and her own operational limitations of age, endurance, material state, long passage, crew fatigue, etc. And of course, it was, even today, people remember the kind of ball of fire that went up that night when Ghazi sank. It lit up, I believe it lit up the entire Vizag skyline. But the sinking of the Ghazi eliminated whatever little underwater threat to the Indian Navy in the east, and thereafter gave it the freedom to operate without any constraints from any of its ports on the east coast. India's lone aircraft carrier, INS Vikrant, for which the Ghazi had been lying in wait, was very cleverly kept away and never approached Vizag throughout the war, and instead operated from Port Blair. Within the first few days, the Eastern Fleet had established total dominance of the Bay of Bengal, which even the threat, if you remember, the US 7 Fleet, we all read about it in the newspaper that the US 7 Fleet is at the mouth of the Bay of Bengal and it's been sent by the Americans to change the course of the war. But even the threat of the US 7 Fleet, which at that time was led by the world's largest aircraft carrier at the time, the nuclear-powered USS Enterprise, could not deter the Indian Navy or the carrier battle group from achieving its ultimate objective. Finally, of course, the US 7 Fleet did not enter the Bay of Bengal. It turned away for various reasons. But what emerged from this was that the Indian Navy was on a sort of mission during the 71 war to prove its credentials in no uncertain terms. And whether it was the West Coast or the East Coast, each of the actions that the Indian Navy undertook, I think, reinforced this view. In the East, of course, Vikrant's actions managed to sever Pakistan supply lines, and its aircraft, which operated from the carrier, caused mayhem in what were then East Pakistani ports, and all this definitely hastened the end of the war. So I think on the East, I know Karachi is, of course, the sort of spectacular act of courage and Navy's initiative, but East, I think, was no less in shaping the outcome of the 71 war.
So, Essensa, you would like to weigh in on this, the Ghazi and the action?
No, they, whatever AJ said, made completes the picture. Other than the fact that the drama that went around to entice Ghazi into Vizag, with all the Rajput roaming around with a whole lot of signals being made, and all that went around, makes very interesting reading. And obviously that is why, and then also the fact that Rajput could drop 2 depth charges to finally set off, maybe coincidental, that the actual explosion of Ghazi was triggered by the depth charges from Rajput. Could be.
So, Amish, just to sort of bring in, I think both our panelists have made this very important point about when the Ghazi sailed to east and she was targeting the aircraft carrier. I think one of the good things that the operational planners did there was realize that rather than direct anti-submarine warfare, where you pitch a ship against a submarine, one good way would be to eliminate the threat of the submarine through a series of strategic measures. So what they did was they made it seem that the fleet and Vikrant is in Vishakhapatnam, so that the Ghazi could be lured to Vishakhapatnam, while the fleet actually operated Port Blair. So that was the first masterstroke, almost 700 miles to the east, so that it could operate with sort of great degree of freedom. And then to reinforce this image of being in Vishakhapatnam, they did a few things. One was demand huge amount of rations in the east to make it seem it's only an aircraft carrier that demands that quality of ration, and make sure that that secret sort of was
leaks out.
Taken down. And then they did lots of heavy signal traffic. Another ship simulated the signal traffic of Vikrant. So to make it, because again, an aircraft carrier has a heavy signal traffic. And a sailor purportedly on Vikrant making a telegram saying that, inquiring about his sick mother. So this was classic masterly strategic deception that they did. And when, of course, then having come there, then I think the bonus was that that ship, through whatever action, but as Commodore A.J. Singh says, the relentless pressure by the Indian Navy. So if your opponent makes an unforced error in that, I guess that you got to take the credit for the pressure that you put him under. And as a consequence of that, you had the Ghazi out of action just as the war, the hostilities started. So I think that was rather brilliant, and it needs a case study in itself.
No doubt it was masterful. And if I may translate this for my civilian viewers, basically Pakistan को बेवकूफ बनाया और गाजी को सिक किया. Sorry for the civilian simple talk. But both the sirs, both the Commodore sirs, if I may ask one question, because one of the things I've learned through these series of webinars that we've done till now, that most naval people see the 1971 war as transformational for the Navy. That the Navy truly proved its mettle in India's war efforts, and that the decision makers must take the Navy far more seriously. So if you could kind of shed some light on that, how important was it was of course transformational for the subcontinent. The new nation was created. They got freedom. Transformational for India, but those are of course other things. But I'm saying for the Navy itself, the 71 war was transformational. So if you could just shed some light on this.
The fact that in 65 the Navy was told to stay clear from the war, right? And so the Navy was just about waiting for a chance to prove its mettle, and they got the chance, right? So when they were really kind of the government turned around and told the Navy that you stay clear of this wartime scenario in 65. Now, I mean, it was kind of an insult, you know. And the moment they got the chance in 71, and the the powers that be said, okay, go ahead. You're there in the war, just do it. Now, that kind of latitude of action. AJ, would like to add something more?
Firstly, of course, yes, sir. To add to what you said, yes, the Indian Navy was really smarting from not being involved in either the 62, of course, was with China, so there was no question of a naval battle. 65 was certainly, the Indian Navy was smarting from that, as I mentioned earlier, and as Commodore S.N. Singh has brought out. And I think 71 proved to the country, to the Navy itself, and to the government that the Navy was an important player in shaping the operational battle space, firstly, and in influencing the outcome of any such conflict. Because navies have the ability of being able to shape outcomes without even firing a shot. If you see Kargil, we never fired a shot, but the Navy had done enough in the North Arabian Sea to keep ships at bay from supporting the Pakistani logistic effort. So that is one, I think, important message that has to come out. The importance of the maritime domain for India's future. I think that is something that the 71 war brought out to a country which was largely continental in outlook. We have two neighbors who are constantly sniping at our heels. And so the political preoccupation has always been in that. That grabs eyeballs, that grabs news headlines. Nobody knows what navies do hundreds of miles out at sea. So that rarely, that always escapes the attention of the decision makers. But I think 71 proved that the maritime domain is equally important. And in the last 50 years, we've seen this has been further reinforced. Today, I can confidently say that in a larger sort of geopolitical scenario, as we are seeing being played out now in the Indo-Pacific, it's the maritime domain that is going to dominate. And it is India which has to ensure that if it has to remain a preeminent Asian power, it has to focus a lot of attention on its maritime capability vis-a-vis its other sort of continental emphasis, which has been there so long. So that, I think, was the message that came home after the 71 war, was the importance of the maritime domain and the confidence of the Indian Navy in being able to successfully execute any operation that it is called upon to do.
So, Shekhawat.
No, I mean, there's so much lessons learned from 71 and all that. And I think we can go on. But, we're also having a look at the clock, right? And we've spent such a lot of time talking and conversing. It's been beautiful. But maybe we could have an interaction with some audience before we have closing comments. I'm sure that there have been constantly lots of observations, comments. So maybe we could have some audience questions. Do we have anyone?
I think.
Yes. May I go ahead?
Yes, hi. Please go ahead.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. My name is Purvi Kamde from Department of Civics and Politics, University of Mumbai. I must say it was a very amazing discussion and many inspiring events that I heard too. About Captain Mulla, who was the commanding officer of Khukri. And then we also heard about how it is challenging to be on the submarine, especially for the commanding officers. So on that note, I wish to take that discussion ahead. I have two questions, both for Commodore A.J. Singh and Commodore Shrikant Kesnur. For Commodore A.J. Singh, what are the leadership challenges for submarine commanding officers during war and peace at both the times? And another one for Commodore Kesnur about the leadership of people at the strategic level in leading Ghazi to its doom by luring it in the sea. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. It was really a very amazing session. Thank you.
Well, I think leadership challenges on a submarine, I think the two most important things that a commanding officer has to focus on, firstly, is the professional competence of his crew. That is absolutely critical.
Right.
Because as I said earlier, It is one man's mistake can take the whole crew down to a watery grave. So it is not about one man being brilliant. It is about each and every guy. You know, in a submarine, even the cook, the guy who cooks the food for the sailors and the officers, has an action station. He has an action job also to do. So when action station closes up on board, he actually leaves the galley and he's got an actual job to perform as an operational sailor with an operational job. It's not that he's just cooking. So when you have to work up a crew to that extent that most of the day he's in the galley, but at that point of time when he has to deliver the goods on something he's trained on, you have to ensure that should come instinctively to him. He shouldn't have to look up a book or read up a standard operating procedure to learn what he has to do. It should come as second nature to him. And if you realize underwater, the situation can turn, it can transform very rapidly. The simple thing, if you have a major flooding on board, let's say a big pipe is given way and you have flooding on board, a submarine can go down from its whatever depth it is operating at to the bottom of the sea in a matter of seconds. Right. Because it is not one emergency that happens by itself. It's a series of emergencies. The seawater will cause short circuiting to happen. The short circuiting will cause a power failure to happen. The power failure will cause the control surfaces to stop functioning. So you realize how fast you lose control of a submarine. So reacting to these kind of emergency situations requires instinctive reactions. You can't start thinking, what am I supposed to do next? There isn't time to think. So the commanding officer's fundamental role in peacetime is to ensure that when it comes to the crunch, the crew is not found wanting in delivering what they're supposed to do. Yes, it's war. Anything can happen. But it should not happen for want of not knowing what to do. It should happen for, okay, it happened, it's war. And that is why, in the NDA, when we joined, the first thing we are told is, the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war. And in submarines, at least, we keep our crews on their toes right through day and night, just to make sure that they understand this adage properly. I think that in peacetime is the most challenging thing for a commanding officer. And of course, to keep the morale up and, you're underwater for 2 months. There's no exposure. You have no communication with your families. Your families don't know where you are. You don't know what's happening with them. And still to keep the morale up, still to keep people going, that it's also is sort of a challenge for a commanding officer. In war, of course, war is a challenge for any commanding officer. So, and here you are in a strange environment. But let me add, in our sort of environment in the Arabian Sea and in warmer waters, the submarine has a distinct advantage over the ship. So it's not in terms of the hydrological profile of water, a submarine which is dived would be able to detect a ship much earlier than the ship would be able to detect the submarine. So it has an inherent advantage. And that is why the job of the surface fleet becomes that much more challenging in detecting a submarine and prosecuting it before the submarine is able to carry out an attack. So it is this sort of cycle of keeping the crew motivated to attack, to carry the damage control, to be alert at all times, to keep them morale up, to keep them motivated, that really occupies the commanding officer's mind on board a submarine.
Purvi, I think that's a very nice question, and many parts of it has come out. I think, war or peace in the navies and militaries is all about leadership. The X factor comes from the leader and leadership. And you can see that in so many descriptions here, the tactical, strategic. Commodore S.N. Singh as a midshipman showed amazing leadership in water, dark night. People have got on a life raft. He's telling them, get down. Bhai, isko, balloon banna hai. Very few people would want to get down then because they're holding on to their dear lives. Now to tell them, get down, let this inflate so that we can get in, requires huge amount of persuasion and leadership. When all of you are out there, So there is leadership at every level. Admiral Shekhawat has written, at that time, the submarine branch was new. When they were deployed off Pakistan coast due to some underwater phenomena, one day they just spun like a cock to the top, he says, and they had to actually surface. Now, imagine if they had been detected when they surfaced, it would have been, that's it, kaput for them. But to go through that situation, get away from there fast, think on your feet, then understand later what these phenomena were. At every stage, Captain Mulla knew with those two ships that he was going into the harm's way. The submarine had a distinct advantage, and yet he did not let that phase him, did not let that phase his men, because that was leadership. But strategic, I'm glad that you again asked for it. And Commodore S.N. Singh made a remarkable statement. He said, Admiral Krishnan sitting in Vizag, he was a CNC, but because there were no fleet commander, he took personal charge to work up the Eastern Fleet. And it was, I think, Admiral Krishnan regarded was one of the most brilliant minds in the Navy that time, who decided on this deception plan, putting the fleet in Port Blair and all that. So you need very clever leadership at all levels, at the field levels, at the operational levels, and at the strategic level. And Indian Navy, both through Admiral Krishnan and Admiral Nanda, showed that. First, the gumption in deploying the fleet, saying we'll take on the submarine threat, then building a series of measures to neutralize that submarine threat. I think 1971 was also remarkable for the leadership that was shown by all our people at various echelons.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. If there's another member of the public, anyone would like to ask a question, if it could be brought up, please. Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Yeah.
Thanks, sirs all. Thank you so much. You know, it's been really, really interesting for me as a Royal Navy submariner of Indian origin, you know, to learn so much, especially from those who've lived and are living the Indian Navy's underwater warfare journey. So really, really, thank you so much for sharing those vivid memories and insights. So we've heard today about, you know, the impressive performance of the Indian Navy's personnel, particularly brave pioneering submariners who distinguished themselves in 1971. But we've also heard about India's, you know, at the time somewhat limited and nascent, I think we could call it, submarine and anti-submarine warfare capabilities, which, notwithstanding the immense professionalism of those personnel, has inevitable operational impact. So what I wonder is if I could ask those on the panel to describe for me what specific lessons were identified and learned after 1971, what development work has been done since then in the past 50 years, and perhaps a little bit about India's ASW program and SM operations today and plans looking ahead, especially given, as the Commodore mentioned, India's current strategic context. Thanks very much, sirs.
Yes, sir. Would you?
Yes, Noor.
Sir, I think this is for Commodore AJ. That's perfectly his territory, sir.
So, you know, Doc, firstly, it's fascinating to know that there was an Indian origin doctor on a Royal Navy submarine. I'm surprised. You know, I visited the Clyde number of times, HMS Clyde a number of times, and we never somehow got to meet when I was posted there. It would have been a pleasure. But coming to what your question, you know, I think 71, as I said, underscored the importance of the Navy. And in the next 50 years, in the 50 years that we've seen, the importance of the maritime domain, you know, today the global center of gravity is the Indo-Pacific. And as its very name suggests, it's the confluence of two oceans, as Prime Minister Abe had described it, and has a very distinct maritime orientation. You know, that's the name itself suggests that. And if we see today, the great game, the power game, is going to be played out in the Indo-Pacific. We have an aspiring global power, and we have a status quo power. Now, if I can name them, if you look at China, China is not favored by maritime geography. It's not favorable to it. It's got too many small islands, territories, countries. So it is fairly restricted in its ability to operate as a blue water power projection capability force to achieve its ultimate aim of global dominance by 2049, as has been articulated by President Xi Jinping. So it needs a larger ocean space to be able to execute its maritime domination strategy. That open ocean space it gets in the Indian Ocean. And over the years, we've been noticing a gradual expansion of its footprint in the Indian Ocean. it's expanding its navy at a phenomenal rate. It's commissioning 20 to 25 major warships every year, which means that, if you take it very broadly, today the PLA Navy, as it is called, already has a force level of over 350 ships. In numbers, it is the largest navy in the world by numbers. Of course, the US Navy has much greater capability. But by 2030 or so, the Chinese Navy is going to have 450 ships, and of which over 150 are going to be blue water capable. If you realize, you probably are familiar that for the last 2 years, we had this big standoff along the line of actual control with China on our disputed land border. They've been sort of sniping at our heels all through. But throughout this entire 2 years, when they put a lot of pressure on us on the border, they stayed clear of the Indian Navy and ensured that they did nothing that could be considered provocative by the Indian Navy. And the reason for this was because they're fully aware of their limitations, capability limitations, and capacity limitations in the Indian Ocean, which they are in the process of addressing at the moment. They have a base in Djibouti. The jetty there is being expanded to accommodate aircraft carriers. They have more or less full control over the port of Godar, and with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, are going to be in proxy control of that entire area. They are setting up a submarine base in Bangladesh called the PNS Sheikh Hasina. They have given a submarine to Myanmar. They have given submarines to Thailand. So they are going to have a submarine presence, their own submarine presence in the Bay of Bengal. Presently, China is limited in being able to deploy its submarines in the Indian Ocean because of the distance those submarines have to transit, and then not having a base facility in the Indian Ocean to be able to replenish them or even give them any kind of support. That is what they are now addressing. So once they have Godar, once they have Bangladesh, once they have Thailand, they will be able to come into the Indian Ocean with their submarines and operate in the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea. They are arming Pakistan with 8 conventional submarines, 8 AIP equipped conventional submarines, and 4 destroyers. Now, why would Pakistan, a country which has a coastline of just a few hundred kilometers, need a force level of 11 submarines? Obviously, it's part of a larger strategy for the region, for the Western Indian Ocean. And Pakistan, I'm sure, will be used as a proxy to contain India in the Indian Ocean. Now, if India has to counter all this, India needs to put in a lot of focus on developing this maritime capability. And that does not necessarily mean that it's not a zero-sum game, that for every ship you've got to have a submarine, or for every submarine you've got to have a ship. It's about overall capability. And I think the Navy in the last few years has been getting considerable attention. We certainly could do with more. The Indian Navy has projected it has its maritime capability perspective plan, which is with the government, which has sort of which has more or less tacit approval of the government. Now, actual programs coming into play will depend on a lot of factors. It depends on budget available. It depends on shipbuilding capacity. It depends on expertise. It depends on technology. It depends on how much technology somebody is willing to transfer. The Prime Minister has now, made what he calls Atmanirbharta, or self-reliance, as a national aim. And he has directed that we have to minimize our defense imports, and everything must be built in India to the extent possible. So all these things will have their own teething troubles. They will have their own sort of, they will take a little time to take off. But I think we are on the right track. We are one of only 6 navies in the world that can build their own nuclear submarines and conventional submarines. We have a ballistic missile submarine capability, a nuclear triad. We are in the process of building our nuclear attack submarines. We have a fairly robust conventional submarine force to take on the littorals. So I think the Navy's in a happy place at the moment, and and will be prepared for whatever comes its way in the Indian Ocean to be able to retain its sort of preeminence in these waters. If that sort of answers the question, I'm not sure whether that's exactly what you wanted to know, but that was a sort of geopolitical overview of the maritime dimension.
So if I can, I just, Commander Tyal, AJ sir has given the strategic analyst's view, and he's looked into the future. So as a historian, I go into the past. So if you look at 71, I think it was a watershed movement, and there were lessons to be learned, right? So loss of Khukri meant that we had to make sure that this should not happen in future. So there's lots of stress on anti-submarine warfare in the years after the war. And one of them was actually the development of an indigenous sonar for the warm waters, which was called the APSO project, headed by a naval officer in uniform, a scientist, Commodore Paul Raj, who is now one of the biggest scientists in the world. You can Google him, Commodore Arogya Swami Paul Raj. And that led to the development of indigenous sonar suited for these waters. Also, I think there was a huge, much larger focus on air ASW to use both fixed wing and rotary wing assets for anti-submarine warfare, greater stress on sonobuoys, on magnetic anomaly detectors and stuff like that. Then the towed arrays came in, ASW corvettes, and for the smaller Abai class in the 80s. And then more recently, we've got indigenously built ASW corvettes in the form of the Kamorta class ships. So on ground, tactically, operationally, to supplement what Commodore A.J. Singh has said, a lot has been happening to make sure that in the realm of ASW, using indigenous scientific bodies, using indigenous knowledge, because this is high-end technology, not many people share it. We have been able to build, I would say, a robust base to make sure that our ASW is at a certain, good, impressive level at this stage.
Just to sum up this whole thing, at the end of it, unfortunately, despite the fact that we've had India as a maritime nation, I would say very brown waterish kind of a thing. Now we start getting into the blue water part, right? So I think things have already started happening. These things don't happen. It takes almost 20 years for a change in attitude. Throughout, we had the army getting all the attention till now. Right? Now it's the Navy's turn. Right? So that's what is actually going to give us the push. So all the toys that AJ has been talking about, and so is Kesnur been talking about, all these things will happen. It happened take about another 10 to 15 years.
Any more question? I think we have Ria there.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. So my name is Ria Velankar, and I work as a curator at Marine Museum Dhaba, which is near Mumbai. So first of all, it is an honor to listen to the story of INS Khukri from a first-person perspective. And my question is towards Commodore S.N. Singh and Commodore Shrikant Kesnur. As a museologist, I was delighted to hear about the Khukri Memorial that has come up at Diu in the last few years. And recently, last year in December, the second avatar of INS Khukri was also placed there. So my question is, how do you view such ventures to enhance maritime awareness? And what more needs to be done in case of public-private partnerships or Navy and public partnerships to create more of such spaces?
Ma'am, it's a very interesting question. Part of my answer was given in the previous question when I was summing it up. India as a nation has started looking more towards the sea and more into maritime related activities and things. It's been a change of attitude. It's happened. Our entire focus till now, for about a few years ago, was everything was army related as far as the defense is concerned. Right? So this change has come about. It's happening. It has to go still a long way. But so specifics, Commodore Kesnur can get into, but from the overall perspective point of view, we are definitely now looking into the maritime domain. Things have changed, and specifics Commodore Kesnur can come up with.
That's a very interesting question, sir, and you summed it up well. This is, I guess, a part of the country looking to the seas more, looking towards the blue waters more. But I think you make a very relevant point in how all of these can enhance maritime awareness, and there's a need for government, navy collaboration, which is happening in the form of not just the Diu Memorial in Vizag, the Kalvari, the Kursura Museum, which is a submarine museum on the beach. I would advise all the viewers to go and look. It's a beautiful piece of museum which combines this and is great tourist attraction. Similarly, the Diu Memorial, I think commemorating the Khukri there, first in the form of a structure at Diu by the administration, and then now the Navy joining in by having the INS Khukri, the second, after decommissioning, placed there, opens us to lots of vistas in which this can be imaginatively used for people to come, experience, understand what all that meant. And sky is the limit. You can have light and sound shows, you can have outdoor installations, you can have people guiding, you are a museologist, you can have people like Commodore S.N. Singh come and talk live there or do recording and explain what happened. So we need, I mean, Europe is full of lots of museums, lots of other countries are full of museums. And I think every country that has a grand military tradition has good museums that encapsulate that military tradition. So I think the time has come for us to have these sort of maritime museums. There's a grand one coming up in Lothal, a few 100 kilometers from Diu. But I think this Diu is again special because it commemorates certain aspects of 71 war and courage under fire. So, and people like you play a very important role in this as museologists.
If I may just add a couple of lines to that, besides, of course, something like Diu will be a national sort of acknowledgement of India's maritime heritage, India's maritime history, India as a maritime nation. But it's these smaller things like the museum in Vizag, the Submarine Museum that Commodore Kesnor alluded to. I happen to command Kursura, by the way, from 95 to 96. So I have a special affinity for that museum. But next to that, now they placed a Tu-142. And the kind of footfall that place has to be seen to be believed.
And also, I believe a Sea Harrier is coming there, sir.
Now Sea Harrier is coming there. Now putting a Tu-142 in Kolkata. So, that's the kind of thing we need, where everybody every evening can come and see something. So the curiosity builds up, the fascination builds up. And I think that is important. Besides, of course, the larger level museums we do at the National Museum level or an international museum level. The International Maritime Museum in Hamburg, if you ever get an opportunity, is perhaps the finest maritime museum I've seen anywhere. It's over 9 floors. It started as one man's private collection of ship models and artifacts from here and there. And then it got the support of philanthropists, it got the support of museum organizations, and is a 9-floor museum. When I was in England at the historic dockyard in Portsmouth, they had recovered parts of the Queen Mary, which was in one small little room. They had just maintained a little bit of the hull and constantly being kept under water and all that. But that year, this particular charity, I forget what it's called, gave 21 million pounds to set up a Queen Mary museum. So that is the sort of initiative you need. That's the sort of effort. And this was all charity. It's not government money. These are charities in the UK which contribute very, very significantly to preserve the maritime heritage of the country. We have to start now getting into that sort of space slowly. I don't know how we'll do it, but we have to do it. Perhaps corporates can step in with CSR activity or whatever. I really don't know how that can work. But I think that's the way to go. And of course, you all as the pioneers would have a major role to play as maritime museologists would have a very important role to play in that.
Thank you so much.
Amish, we have time for one question more, I think.
I think so, yeah. Let's have this one last question and then we can have final words and close the program.
Yeah, good evening. It was a very interesting webinar and, a lot of insights, a lot of stories from the 70th war. And so one thing that I wanted to put forward to the panelists and probably Commodore Kesnor was that we can see from the 70th war that with regards to the technology curve, India at that point of time was not much ahead of Pakistan, so to say, in that aspect. What I would like to know now is that given today's modern day warfare or today's age, how important it is for a nation to be, to have that edge with regards to technology over its opponent, so as to ensure a decisive victory in case of conflict. How important is the technology aspect of warfare? Thank you.
AJ sir, you'd like to go? Take it.
I think it was a question to you, but nevertheless, well, Sharad, let's face it, technology is going to drive modern warfare. It's going to make the difference, as a force multiplier. And I think every country is focusing on that aspect now. I don't know if you're aware, but China has something called a civil-military fusion strategy. That all the civilian technologies that they're developing, disruptive technologies, are also being merged into military applications at the same time. But I'd also like to add that, armed forces are a little slower at adapting to these kind of changes rapidly, because when you go to war, you've got to be very sure of what you're going with your technology. So only after it matures to a certain extent do armed forces really adopt it. This is a shift from the good old days when armed forces drove critical technologies. The internet is a US Air Force creation. But yes, technology is going to play a very important role. Every day we are seeing the advancements in technology. Now we are going to unmanned technologies. We're going to quantum technologies, which give you a whole different dimension to communication, or give you a whole different dimension to navigation, space, cyber, information warfare. You don't have to. You can probably win half a battle or half a war without even firing a shot, just using information warfare or technology or cyber, etc. So I think it's going to play a very important role. I mean, in a nutshell, it's going to be the decisive factor in future warfare.
Thank you, sir.
Sharad, if I can add again, I would talk like a historian, because I'm very afraid to look into the future. I'm not very good at making predictions. But I only half agree with you. I think 71 war. I take a larger point that we were probably having lots of ships, the Khukri class itself, the Brahmaputra class, even the Mysore and Delhi for that matter, which were not exactly the most modern for that time. So perhaps the gap between Pakistan and India was not probably pronounced. But I think from mid-60s, the Indian naval planners had worked. The Petias were state of the art for that time, which we had got. The submarines were procured in those 4 years, though of course we needed greater experience with them. The missile boats were absolutely the latest. Missile warfare had just started in the late 60s. We got in the Sea Kings. So there was a sort of drive by the Indian naval leadership to incorporate latest technology within the constraints of our budget and whatever we could get at that time. But yes, larger point I think was learned. ASW technology we were able to leapfrog. And much of the Navy that you see today, I mean, from ships, second-hand ships that we brought from other countries to be building in less than 50 years or 50 years from building state-of-the-art world-class ships now with best of the sensors, to have those fusion, to have your satellite up, to have network-centric operations. I think we've come a huge, long way. And to a large extent, this technology race, it is good to be ahead. And to that extent, I think the naval leadership is very, very cognizant of this. And I think today's Navy is something you can be proud about, the technology that we have.
Thank you, sir.
Good. Thanks, Sharad. Shrikant, perhaps if we could, we should have our guests deliver any final words they'd like to deliver before we call a close to this webinar. What do you say?
Yes, sir. Closing comments by Commodore S.N. Singh and Commodore AJ, sir.
Thank you so much for the opportunity of having being able to to speak what I wanted to on the subject of the Khukri and the other subjects, and it was very nice also to see the outside with the civilians interacting at this level is very interesting. So I have to thank both of you for this. And thank you very much.
AJ,
Well, I
sir.
just want Well, I'll just thank you. I have really nothing to say. Thank you very much. It's been a great opportunity. And I think this initiative that you've taken, Amish, with the Nehru Center and Shrikant and Anil Jaggi, I think it's remarkable. It's very, very important that Indians understand Maritime India. And let me reassure all Indians that Maritime India is in safe hands with the Indian Navy. Keeping forward very, very, we've set very high, our pioneers have set very high traditions, and I'm glad that the Navy is taking them further forward, the Navy of today.
Commodore AJ Singh, Commodore SN Singh, sir, both of you, sirs, thank you so much for coming on our platform. Dr. Amita ji, and of course, most of all, Admiral Shekhawat, the hyper achiever. Thank you so much, sirs, for coming on our platform. But the last word must be said by my dear friend Shrikant, who I've got to know over the course of these series. Shrikant, you have the last word, and then you can call a close to the seminar.
Thank you. I thought it's usually you, but thank you for giving me this opportunity. I think, thanks. We've had some remarkable guests today, achievers all, giving us different perspectives. One of the things that all of us need to know, our listeners, viewers, is that undersea warfare is a very, very complex game. And I think the 71 war showed it in all dimensions, the strategic dimensions, the leadership dimensions, the poignancy of a loss, our own submarines being deployed. What we must not forget is that in the 60s, the Pakistanis actually had a head start. They had acquired submarines before us. And what it meant was that if we got our submarines later, it meant also that our anti-submarine warfare training opportunities were limited. One of the reasons possibly that our fleet didn't have enough anti-submarine warfare resources was because our submarines got in late. So in many ways, the 71 war deployment of our submarines, where they were able to operate with certain impunity, having 3 out of 4 there is remarkable. Then taking out Ghazi, and then the example set by Khukri, courage under fire. All of this singly and collectively, I think, gave us a lot of lessons for the future in the tactical, in the operational, in the strategic, and in the leadership realm. And this is one of the most fascinating chapters of 1971 war. And I think there's lots for future students of Navy and maritime history to study about this war. So thanks a lot. And thanks as usual for being this wonderful host, for having all of us today evening to be able to discuss this.
Wonderful. Namaste, Jai Hind.
Namaste.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.